Hey guys, this is Coffee for HUSNG.com. Today I'm taking on a walkthrough of the CoffeeHUD. It's a HUD optimized for heads-up sit-and-goes for PT4. It was created by me and 2P2er But It's Wrong, and today I'm going to show you how to install it, how to interpret the statistics, and how to use it to get a bigger edge against your opponents. Alright, so before we get started, I want to show you quickly how to go about paying for and installing the CoffeeHUD if you do choose to purchase it. So what you need to do is you first need to open up the installer. And what will happen is this page will pop up asking for license validation. So what you need to do is you copy your hardware ID and paste it into the payment page on HUSNG.com. And that'll allow you to be able to get a license code that works for your computer. Now, I do want you to be careful with these license codes. If you do use it on the wrong computer, it can invalidate the license itself. So if you do need to use it for more than one computer, if you grind on two different computers, send me an email at coffeeyay@gmail.com. And, with the details of your situation, I can try to accommodate you. But don't just, use the same license code for a different computer, because it could invalidate the license. So once you've gotten, your license ID, you just plug it in here. You click Validate, and that'll take you into the installer, and then it'll install the CoffeeHUD. Once you have completed the installation, which I already have, what you'll need to do is you need to go to HUD, Edit HUD Options. You go to Profile Select. The default is General Settings, so Profile Select. You need to make sure to click T because you want it as a tournament HUD, and then you just select the CoffeeHUD. It should actually be the first one that pops up. And here you'll have the HUD profiles. So what you can actually do is set up what games you have it use it for, and for heads up, and even you choose which sites you use it for. So if you play, and no limit. So this allows you to use the CoffeeHUD when you need it. You click Add, and it'll set it up as your HUD, and you just click OK. Once you've taken care of that, the HUD will be installed. All the custom stats will work. Everything will be good. So that's how you have to do it. You run the installer. That'll make sure that all the custom stats get put in the right places. And then once you've done that, you select your HUD, and it works. So welcome to the CoffeeHUD. So the way this works is all the stats are divided into groups. So although there's a lot of different stats and they do take up space on the table, you have a maximum flexibility in how you want to situate your stats. You can move them around to however you feel fits your aesthetics and however fits your table. Obviously every different software has different setups of the table. So but I am confident that they will fit on every table. Heads Up has a lot of dead space on the tables. You will find ways to fit all these stats, and these stats are just really useful, so you will want them all available to you. I don't really like the idea of pop-ups, because in my opinion, if a stat isn't available to you on first sight, it's not going to be that useful. You really don't often have times, especially in the hypers, to be looking at pop-ups, to be glancing over, especially if you're multi-tabling. So the idea is to have all the stats already available so that you don't have to do that, so you can multi-table. A couple neat little tricks is that you can actually, what you can do is slide the pre-flop stats together. So what you can do is you can slide the big B stats underneath small blind stats, and that saves you a little bit of room. And you might find this more aesthetically pleasing. You can actually do the similar thing with the post-flop stats and slide those BB stats underneath the small blind ones. Just depending on how your table is situated and how you want it. So usually for east-west tables, it makes sense to combine the pre-flop and stats. For north-south tables, if we had our table set up north-south, it makes more sense to separate the two, but maybe combine these. Overall, I enjoy having as much information as possible so I don't make mistakes. So I actually like to have them both separated. It's a little bit redundant, but it helps me just be able to get a quicker sense of which stat I'm actually looking at, either which effective stacks or flop, turn, river. Again, it's redundant, but sometimes redundancy can help. So, beside the aesthetics of being able to move things around and situate them, I wanted just start talking about the specific stats. So First off, we have the effective stacks. The one little caveat that I'll give about the effective stacks counter is it does lag when blinds change. Unfortunately, that's due to the definition in Poker Tracker. There's really nothing that can be done about it. It'll lag behind one hand when the blinds change. It won't take into account the blinds change for the first hand. After that, it will. And it updates every single hand other than when the blinds change. Next thing to talk about is the Hero HUD. So I know that, most people, the optimal Hero HUD for most people, including me, would be a HUD that displays what stats your villain sees when he's playing against you. And unfortunately, the CoffeeHUD does not do this. It's not something that's currently possible in Poker Tracker. It comes out of the logistical technicalities when dealing with 6-max or full ring play. You just don't have that capability. You'd have to have 6 or 9 HUDs on the table at all times and changing whatever table people leave on or enter the table. So right now it is impossible. So the way I suggest to use the Hero HUD is just as a measure of the dynamics of what you've done recently. And so I always set it to the session stats and just have sort of bare bones stats that you can use just to have a sense of how you've been playing recently. If you've been barreling a lot, to see what kind of dynamics your villain might feel. So the hero stats are just pre-flop raise, limp, fold versus 3-bet, flop c-bet, turn c-bet, and limp c-bet, which is a custom stat. It's a c-bet in a limped pot. So you limp, villain checks back, villain checks flop, and you bet the flop. And big blind, we have flat, 3-bet, and flat is actually defined specifically for small bets. So it's for 3x and below. So this is flat bets, so it doesn't just keep out open shoves out of it. It is actually hands that you flat and play post-flop. 3-bet, isolate, that's raise limps. Fold versus c-bets, fold versus limp c-bets, that's again, limp c-bet is the c-bet in a limped pot. And limp donk, so donk and limped pots. So just, the bare bones that'll help out. And so then continuing on, we can start talking about the pre-flop stats. One little feature I want to mention right now, because it does relate to also hero stat, is on any stat you can hover over it to get a specific information about it, specifically what the stat is and what sample size you have for that stat, including what sample size you have for that stat in this session, not just lifetime. So in pre-flop, I'll just go through the small blind stats. So we have hands, and this is specifically hands in small blind, not total hands. That's why there's a discrepancy between this number and this number. It's pre-flop raise. That's all pre-flop raises. That includes min raises, 3x's, 5x's, whatever, and open shoves. Limp fold, limp raise, fold versus 3-bet. I'll talk about this stat in a little bit more detail because there's fold versus 3-bet, there's 4-bet, and there's also fold versus 3-bet shove. I'll talk about the differences between fold versus 3-bet and fold versus 3-bet shove. But before I do that, let me sort of jump down into one of the major features of the CoffeeHUD, and it's the fact that our stats, not only do we have the total stats, in the top row, these are total stats. These are the same kind of stats that you would get in a normal HUD. So if you're transitioning over from a normal HUD, or you have small sample, or you're just used to knowing, you have a good sense of what total stats mean in game, these are total stats, and so you can use them the same way you would on every other HUD. But we also have stats divided into different effective stack bubbles. So we have 30 plus big blind, 17 to 30, 12 to 18, 7 to 13, and 0 to 8. The reason for these specific bubbles is to maximize utility and sample size. Those are the major things I was looking at. Yes, there is a difference between the game, 20 big blinds deep and 25 and 30. But overall, those differences are fairly small, and it makes sense to sacrifice a little bit of the functional differences in order to get better sample size, in order to make the numbers that appear actually useful. That's also the reason behind the overlapping numbers. It helps build sample size, and it helps define range. The ranges at these different stack depths better. The last thing to notice too about these different things is that the overlapping feature means that you have a better sense of what to do on the border. So if you are exactly 17 big blinds deep, you can get a sense of, whether he's playing more deep stacked or whether he's shorter and how his game changes. And so you can still get an idea of how he plays, let's say something like 16 to 20 big blinds deep just by comparing the two stats and by using that overlapping feature. And so then, once we have, so these are the different bubbles, and then that divides all of our preflop stats by effective stacks. And let me talk about a little bit of how some of them work specifically. So 30 plus is for deeper stack play. Unfortunately, I don't have any sample. That's actually the reason you don't see a hand there is because I don't have any sample. The way the hands work is it's darker color when it's a lower sample, and it gets brighter as you get a bigger sample. And so it's actually black when it's 0. So that's why you don't see even a number. And so the stats for 30 plus work basically normally. They're the same stats you would use everything else. Pre-flop raise is just the sum of all raises. Min raise is also just a min raise. One thing about min raise, it's actually defined as a 2.25x or bigger or smaller. Sorry. So a 45 and hypers of 45 with a Skywalker raise is considered a min raise. I consider it basically functionally identical. And it helps keep in things like people using 41. So that's preflop raise. That's min raise. Open shove starts being defined, and obviously it becomes part of preflop raise. One quick thing to know, especially 30 plus, if you're dealing with someone who 3x's, it'll show up in the preflop raise numbers. So what you can do to get a sense of how his 3x range differs from his min raise range is compare preflop raise to min raise. Preflop raise is going to be the sum of min raise, open shove, and any other raises. So since we know open shove and we know min raise, we actually know any other raises as well by looking at the preflop raise numbers. All right. So the stats that are a little bit blind specific are actually fold versus 3-bet. So in the total stat, it's fold versus all 3 bets. However, when we start talking about 17 and 30, we divide fold versus non-all-in 3-bets, which is on the left, and fold versus 3-bet shoves over on the right. And so that lets you get a better sense of how villains actually play against all the different kinds of 3-bets that you're using. Another stat to notice is the Limp Trap stat. I didn't even mention this. This is defined from 13 big blinds and below, and it's the frequency at which your opponent limped a trapping hand, and then divided by the frequency at which your opponent limped a hand that saw showdown plus a hand that limp folded. So what it does is it filters out the times opponent limp called a shove, for instance, with 10-7 off. That doesn't count as a limp trap. It only counts as a limp trap if your villain showed you a value hand. So that's what limp trap means. It's also worth knowing that at shorter stacks, preflop raise is the only stat it shows. Just because a min raise and open shove, all those are going to be very similar at 0 to 8. So it's your basic measure of open shoving. Similarly, when we get down to 7 to 13, fold versus 3-bet turns back into fold versus total 3-bet, just because a non-all-in 3-bet is going to be very similar to an actual 3-bet. Otherwise, all the stats work as they do. They're just divided by effective stacks, so we get a better sense of how villain plays and when he starts open shoving and what his ranges look like. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the video. Post-flop, we can see again the different stats. So again, it's hands. The one thing to notice with hands is this time it's specifically hands versus an open. And it's versus a normal size open. So it's defined as 3x or below. Unless we're shorter stacked. And then it's defined as a min raise or below. And so the idea behind giving these total numbers is it takes out the hands that we open folded. So those don't count towards the sample to give you a better idea what the sample size means. And it takes out the hands that, villain did something different. So it's specifically how he deals versus your min raises, or 3x's if we're deeper. And not how he deals versus your open shoves, not how he deals versus your limps. I know that I hate it when a VPIP includes raises over limps and not raises over limps. I want to just know, what size is his total range that he's playing against my min raises, for the most part in hypers, or 3x 30 plus, and that's what this number gives. And that's actually what these hand samples mean too. Obviously, if you want a better sense of what the actual hands he's playing big blind, we can just look over at the small blind ones, and they should be almost the same. And we can compare them all to the total statistics as well. So we have sort of 3 different hand numbers that'll change and give you sort of maximum amount of information by not being redundant. And so again, so VPIP is specifically VPIP versus raises, and it's going to be versus small raises when you're shorter. Flat is also defined the same way. It's the hands that he actually flatted when we min-raise, so it doesn't count open shoves. So it doesn't count the times villain called open shoves. That's a major thing to remember. It doesn't, yeah. Call open shove is a stat that's defined a little bit shorter, and again, it's just a number of times villain open shove. It is defined sensibly that, if your villain opens to something like 10x, that does count as an open shove. If he's effectively open shoving, that does count as an open shove, so be aware of that. And then we have the 3-bet and 3-bet shove stats. And these work very similarly to fold versus 3-bet and fold versus 3-bet shove. The total stat for all hands is just the same as in any HUD. It's just a 3-bet stat. How much has he been 3-betting? But when we divide by stacks, it becomes different. And, at 17 to 30 big blinds, we have a 3-bet and we have 3-bet shove, and the numbers are separated. Similarly at 12 to 18. At 7 to 13, they're squashed back together because villains so rarely 3-bet not all in, and a non all in 3-bet is very, very close to a 3-bet shove at this depth. So to get better sample size, it makes sense to group them together. And lastly, we have ISO, which is isolate limpers. So this is raise over limps. Another very useful stat that many HUDs don't have. So continuing on, we can move up. I forgot to mention this earlier. This is just a little opponent identifier. So it just has the name. By the way, in case you're wondering, Captain Crunch is a student of mine, and this is 2 games that we played like 6 months ago or something like that. So he's not upset that I'm showing off his stats, since it's not really his stats anymore. In any case, we also have the name of the player, the total number of hands, and the aggression frequencies. This is the total aggression frequency, the flop aggression frequency, turn aggression frequency, and river aggression frequency. So this just kind of gives you a sense of how aggressive as a player is he, just like general sense of how the player plays. And then lastly, we can start talking about the post-flop stats. So post-flop is divided into flop, turn, and river stats to help you, gather things. So so we can start, immediately with small blind. We have a c-bet, and so it's flop, turn, c-bet. So obviously it's times where we c-bet the flop, times where we c-bet the flop, then barrel the turn, times where we c-bet the flop, then barrel the river. We c-bet the flop, c-bet the turn, and barrel the river. Fold c-bet versus raise and barrel. This is another cut. So fold c-bet versus raise is just fold your c-bet versus a check raise. But it also works as a barreling. So if you fold to the check raise and then folds to the barrel. So that gives you a little bit of extra information on the turn. Limp c-bet, that's just how much he c-bets in limped pots, as I defined in the hero HUD. And again, it's defined for flop, turn, and river. So we can see villains' barreling tendencies in limped pots, as well as min-raise pots. And so the idea, again, is to separate these 2 stats out. So c-bet stats won't be affected by limped pots, and limped pots won't be affected by c-bet, by raised pots. And again, we have just fold, limp, c-bet versus raise and barrel. That works the same way as fold, c-bet versus raise and barrel, but in a limped pot. Next, we have fold versus donk and barrel. So this is in a raised pot. Villain donks out, and so how much he folds versus us, our donk. Sorry, we donk out because villain's in small blind, so we're in big blind. We donk out. How much does he fold? And then how much, furthermore, does he fold on turns and rivers to barrels? So we donk the flop and then barrel on turn. How much is he folding on that turn? Barrel the river. How much is he folding on the river? And then we have the same stat, fold versus limp, donk, and barrel. That's the same stat, just in limped pots. Next, we have fold versus c-bet in a 3-bet pot. So if we 3-bet, and how much is villain folding out of position when we c-bet the pot? And again, it's defined on fold, flops, turns, and rivers. Raise versus c-bet in a 3-bet pot, that's again just he raises our c-bet in these on the flop or turn. River, usually there's not enough size to raise. And then we also have fold versus probe. So probe bet is actually over here as well. it's defined as when we or villain bet versus a missed c-bet. So fold versus probe is specifically when villain checks behind the flop when he could have c-bet, and we bet the turn. How much is he folding? And the river stat is if he checks back the turn, how much, and we bet the river how much he's folding. Continuing on to big blind, these stats are also going to be a similar idea. Fold versus c-bet, that's how much he's folding versus our c-bets. This is how much he raises versus c-bets, so how much he check raises. Flop, turn, and river all are different c-bets. End barrel is how much he's raising our c-bet and then barreling. So on turn, it's the specific stat is he raised our c-bet, we flatted, and he barrels. And same for river. Then we have fold versus limp c-bet. So again, this is just the same stat, but a limped pot. How much is he folding versus our c-bets in a limped pot. Same defined for flop, turn, and river. Raise versus limp c-bet. Again, it's just how much does he raise our c-bets in the flop, turn, and river. We also have donk and barrel. How much is villain donking into us on the flop, and then barreling off on turns and rivers. And we have limp donk and barrel. How much is he donking out on us on the flop, and barreling turn and river in a limped pot. Then we have c-bet, 3-bet. That's c-bets in the 3-bet pot. And lastly, we have just the probe stat, which again is how much is he betting when we miss our c-bet by checking back the flop, or checking back the turn. How much is he betting the river? And so that gives you an idea of what all these stats mean. And so the things to talk about are how to use some of these stats, and what do all these color codes mean. So the CoffeeHUD has intelligently designed color coding. I went through and color coded every single stat independently, individually, and so the stats are based on theoretical numbers. So to give you a better sense, we're going to need to switch over to a villain that I have more sample on. I'll make sure to censor out this villain's name because I'm sure he wouldn't be happy having all of his stats just broadcast on YouTube. But I'll show you around, and that'll give you a better idea of how the color coding works, because it works a lot better when you have bigger sample. Here, some of the samples are a little bit small, so it's not as illustrative. So I'll switch over to that right now. Alright guys, so I'm back with a villain that I have a bigger sample size against, 528 hands. I know you can't quite see how many hands because it's blurred over the name. But yeah, it's 528 hands total versus his villain. And so we can start getting a look at how the color coding system works. The idea behind the color coding is to try to draw your eyes to the stats that you should worry about. So for all the different stats, the system is that bright green is a very tight range, light green is a fairly tight range, white is sort of a standard range, and then light pink is aggressive, and red is light pink is wide, and red is very wide. So we can kind of take a look at this specific villain stats, and we can see that his pre-flop raise is pretty high, and we can see that 73 is light pink, and so it's right on the border of really high. But we can see at 17 to 30 is actually very high, and 79. Whereas 12 to 18, he's got a lower pre-flop raise. And that's one thing that we immediately can start using the CoffeeHUD for, is being able to find places where the total HUD stat isn't correctly reflected. So here we can see that 1730, he's a 79 opener, but at 12 to 18, he's 59. So it should change how much we're 3-betting. The other kind of stat, overall, the idea is that the white stats are the ones that we don't really need to adjust to. Red stats are likely ones that we, should make sure to adjust to. And then light pink and light green are, same with bright green. We should definitely adjust to it if there's a sample size. But the light pink and the light green are sort of caution signs. So we can see that, we should definitely be aware that he's opening really wide and be willing to do a lot of stuff versus him 1730. But, 12 to 18, we have to be a little bit more cautious. He's got a little bit of a tighter raising range. Min-raise is only 56, so I can't 3-bet shove quite as much. Whereas at 7 to 13, we can see that his back to have a very high pre-flop raise, but kind of a low min-raise. So it's kind of a cautious range, whereas he open shoves a lot. This is another spot where we can find how the CoffeeHUD gives us an advantage, because what we can see is that his min-raising range, 7 to 13, is going to be quite strong. His fold versus 3-bet's pretty low, although the sample size is probably going to be kind of small. I can kind of hover over it. I'll have to make sure to blur the name when it pops up. But yeah, we can see that it's 5 of 11, so it's kind of low. But, the thing that really tells us it's pretty strong is that he's min-raising 29%, not folding versus 3-bets all the time, but still open shoving 42. So what this will tell us is that his open shove range is going to be really weak, whereas his min-raise range is going to be really strong, and we won't get too much fold equity. Another thing to point out, we can start looking at some of the places where he's a little bit more tight, and that's out of position. We can immediately see that 17 to 30, his VPIP is like 46. And so the reason it's light green is that means that we can exploit it. That we're getting enough pure fold equity to play any two cards from in position if we min-raise. So min-raising is going to be better than folding, and we immediately know that when we see that light green color. Light green is going to really imply that. Bright green is going to imply that it's much better. Light green is going to imply that it's better, but we maybe should still consider other options, depending on 3-bet and exactly what his VPIP is. We might want to limp still, but when it's bright green, that he's very tight. So we can see that furthermore, we can see that he's pretty tight with his flats as well, and his 3-betting is 17 to 30 is split between 3-betting, not all in, 3-bet shoving. This 3-bet shove range is likely very tight. 10% is a pretty tight range. So it's mostly going to be pocket pairs and ace-x. On the other hand, 12 to 18, we can see that completely changes. His VPIP is, higher, actually. He flats a lot less, but he 3-bet shoves 43% of hands. So we can immediately start seeing, again, a spot where we should be adjusting his 3-bet shove. 43 is a very high percent. And we should immediately realize that and, be much more willing to limp more hands. Be much more willing to bet call wider. And that kind of thing. We can also see what's interesting is that 0 to 8, he's been pretty tight with his call open shove. So the open shove numbers right now, for open shove for 0 to 8, that's just pre-flop raise, and call open shove are actually based on the Nash equilibrium. So white is playing around Nash. And anything more red, light pink and red are wider than Nash, and light green and green is tighter than Nash. So right now he's calling significantly tighter than Nash open shoves. Although, again, we can hover over it to get a sample size, and we see that it's actually 8 out of 20. So it's actually not that bad a sample size. He's definitely calling shoves fairly tight. We should be willing to shove wider than Nash versus this kind of guy. On the other hand, we can see the flip side. His pre-flop raise of 73 is actually wider than Nash. And so again, we want to be calling shoves actually wider than Nash. So this is, the kind of villain that, we can make adjustments to just based on, even just based on these color codes. We can look over at the flop and turn, the post-flop stats and look at some of his tendencies, and we can again get a sense of this kind of thing. And we can see that, his C-bets are very, very aggressive. He's got an aggression of high C-bet on every single street. But we can also see on the flip side that he folds the C-bets 42% of the time. So again, the reason it's light green is that we again can exploit that because we can be C-betting basically 100% of flops. If we half-pot C-bet, on average, our half-pot C-bet is always going to be profitable. Sure, there will be specific flops where likely he's folding versus C-bet less than that because his range hits the board. But in general, we can get a sense that, we can C-bet a lot. But we can also see that right below that, the raise versus C-bet is light pink. So we can immediately see that he folds versus C-bet a lot, but he also check raises quite a bit. So, a likely adjustment versus kind of villain would be to C-bet smaller. And we can C-bet basically 100% of boards, C-bet a little bit smaller in the half pot to really exploit his fold versus C-bet. And realize that since he's check raising wide, we won't lose value when we C-bet a little smaller, because when we do have a value hand, a third of the time he's going to check raise and give us value on it. Similarly, we can see fold versus limp C-bets really high. That's another place where we can push him around. We can try to steal a lot of pots because 73 is a very high percent. And overall, we can see other stats like that. Donk and barrel is green, 6%. So in this case, since it's an aggressive stat, It actually more means caution, tight range. His donk and barrel range. He really doesn't use it very often, so it's likely a tight range. It's not 100%. Obviously, we can never really know something behind a frequency, but it suggests a tight range, which suggests a strong one. And again, we can look at some of the other stats like fold, c-bet versus raise and barrel. He folds versus check raises 54% of the time. And this is another stat that we can see it's in light green. And that's because this means that we can non-all-in 3-bet. And we can non-all-in 3-bet 3x a half-pot c-bet and know that we get enough fold equity on average. So this means that we can really be check-raising wide versus kind of villain if it's 54. We still have to be a little cautious because it's close to the break-even point. But it's enough to start, wanting to check-raise more versus this kind of villain, especially given his very wide c-bet. This is likely a very, very profitable villain to check-raise because he c-bets wide and then folds the c-bet versus raises a lot. And he folds versus barrels as well quite a bit. 50% is, again, a pretty high number, considering that often on the turn we're going to be half-pot betting. And so, we can look at all these kind of stats and really just get a sense of how, this villain plays and how we can exploit him. The other last thing to notice, the hand stats are actually set up that when you have a low sample, they're dark and they get brighter as we get a bigger sample. And that's why actually you don't see the hand sample for 30 plus. It's because it's black. 0 is black. For the other ones, we actually have enough sample that they have lit up. All right, just to give you guys a little bit more value, I'm going to do another analysis of a villain. This guy's another guy I have a lot of hands on. This is actually not a reg, or at least not a good reg. This is someone I was hunting. And we can try to figure out, why I don't think this is a very good reg. And again, what the color coding shows us and how we can use the CoffeeHUD to our advantage versus this kind of player. So we start looking at his preflop stats, and we can immediately get a really good sense of, what kind of villain this is. And he's very tight. All his ranges are on, green. There are just a few ranges that are wider, and those are passive ones. Limping. His open shove is a little bit wide, 7 to 13, and he's a little bit wider than Nash, 0 to 8. Otherwise, all his stats are really low. He's very, very passive. And so we can immediately, start looking for plans to exploit him. His pre-flop, we can start looking, for instance, 17 to 30. When he does limp, it's a very weak limp. Once he limp trapped us 1 out of 5 times, but he doesn't limp very much. No, actually, he limps 25% of the time, sorry. And he limp folds 80%. So immediately we can know we should be raising his limps really wide. He doesn't fold versus 3-bets much. That's one thing to realize. But notice that he opens 44%. His min-raise range is 43%. That's really tight. His total pre-flop raise is just really, really tight. And he doesn't limp that much to make up for it, especially since he's limping mostly. Limp folding. So we can immediately get a sense that, his min-raise range is strong, but, he really doesn't do it much. So that makes him more profitable. And again, we can get a better sense, as he gets shorter, his pre-flop range becomes more open shoves. But, 12 to 18, he's still mostly, his pre-flop raise is still mostly min-raises. And he just limps a lot more. But he limp folds, even more. So we can again see that the way to exploit this guy is to really not play back versus min-raises, but play back a ton versus limps. He just doesn't really limp trap that much, considering he limp folds 86% of the time. Similarly, 7 to 3 big blinds, we can finally see a number that's about average, and that's 45. And we can see actually the one thing that we can immediately get out of the CoffeeHUD, when I was playing him, I didn't have this capability, and so I thought, he's a nit all the time. But actually, it turns out that as he gets short, 7 to 13, 0 to 8, he actually becomes more aggressive, specifically with open shoving. 0 to 8 big blinds, he's shoving wider than Nash. And, 7 to 13, he's actually shoving pretty wide, 33%. Given that his pre-flop raise is pretty tight, he's min-raising 11%. And he's never folding versus 3-bet. So again, we know that his min-raise range is entirely value. He's open shoving everything short of that, but actually quite wide. So we should actually be calling his open shoves pretty wide, considering he's not shoving the top 11%. So his range we should be calling wider than if he were shoving 44%. So really we can be calling with a good amount of hands. And that's something that, when I was playing her, I don't think I picked up. because it was hidden in all of those other stats. All I saw was the pre-flop raise 45, and that's it. And here we can immediately get a sense that his pre-flop raise is 45 at 7 to 13, and it goes up at 0 to 8. And before that, it was even tighter. Out of position, we can get the other half of the story of why it was hunting him. His VPIP versus raises is 31%. You're just printing money versus guys like this. That's why he's bright green. Every single min raise with every single hand is better than 0 EV from start of hand. That's huge. He's bleeding money so bad, and he's barely ever flatting and in 3 bets. So, again, there's no reason to do anything other than min raise versus this kind of guy. And we do have a sense that, his flatting ranges are kind of tight. His call open shove is also really tight. 0 to 8 big blinds, he's significantly tighter than Nash, 39%, calling open shoves. So, can really push this guy around. That's the kind of open shove where call open shove numbers where we should be open shoving 100% rather than open shoving Nash. Nash is not not going to be max EV versus this kind of guy when he's calling open shove so tight. Similarly, 7 to 13 big blinds, his VPIP drops. So this is the kind of guy where, his 3-bet is 23%. So we should be basically min-raising any 2 cards and throw in a few open shoves just because he calls open shoves so tight. Probably with some hands that do well against the top of his range, we can get away with open shoving. But for the most part, we don't need to because he calls open shoves about the same as he 3-bet shoves. So, we have to keep that in mind that he's basically he's not really flatting. So min raising versus this guy is going to be better than open shoving with basically every hand. Just because we can fold to his shoves pretty happily unless we have a value hand. And so these are the kind of stats. And again, we can also see that he doesn't raise limps. He's just an overall nit. And we can see that, post flop as well. He does know how to c-bet, but he never turn barrels. He folds c-bets versus raising barrels. Not, pretty... he actually doesn't fold too much versus a check raise, but we can see that kind of comes out of the fact that his opening range is so tight. The other things we can see is that he is kind of aggro in limp pots. When he does limp c-bet a lot, but he folds versus check raises. So, or at least he has probably the one time I check raised. We can also see that he's really tight folding versus c-bets. Again, 60% fold versus c-bets, huge. It's the same kind of number as, his low VPIP. We should be c-betting 100%, which again might not be something that we'd think of given that he's so tight out of position. We can kind of get a sense of maybe the numbers. Make sure to censor it again. His value is 6 out of 10. So, we just didn't get too many opportunities to c-bet just because of his very low flatting range. Those are the kind of things we can get out of the CoffeeHUD that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. So I hope you guys will consider buying the CoffeeHUD. This is really something that I invested a lot of time and energy into. I think that it's, when I was thinking about, what kind of HUD do I want? This is what I designed, this is what I want. This is my dream HUD. I really, it's really not missing very much. At this point, the only thing that, in terms of missing features is the fact that the hero HUD doesn't display what the villain sees. And unfortunately, that's impossible. But otherwise, we have so many useful stats, all organized aesthetically so that we can grab them quickly while multi-tabling. The color coding system lets us really quickly get a sense of how our villain plays just by glancing, not even needing the numbers. We can just check the color coding and get a sense of how our villain plays and how we can exploit him, when we can use what kind of sizings, what kind of frequencies we can use versus our villain to really exploit the hell out of him. And what kind of, sneaky things is he doing? Because, things like having, open shoving really wide 0 to 8 big blinds isn't going to be something that you'll be able to see on a HUD otherwise. And so, it's going to be so useful. And the 7 to 13 big blind stats, the fact that he actually widens his range at that point, and his min raising range is pure nuts, that kind of stuff just saves you money. And so I'm really confident that, while the CoffeeHUD is an investment, it's an investment that will increase your ROI because it will help you. This is versus reg. So, obviously this is where it looks the most flashy, where the color coding makes the most difference versus people who've played before. But notice that, regardless of anything else, we have the CoffeeHUD does include all the total stats as well. So if you are playing against someone in the first game, I mean, it's certainly not going to be any worse than any other HUD. And I still believe that, getting a sense of how villains play at different stack depths, even if it's low sample, still helps. And we can try to see trends, and we can try to use our own sense of what low sample size means, and sense of Bayesian statistics to try to figure out things from low stats as well. So while I do think the CoffeeHUD shines when you have a huge sample, and you can sort of read out villains' game plan off the HUD, I still think that it is very useful for smaller samples as well. This was CoffeeA for HUSNG.com. If you're interested in purchasing the CoffeeHUD, visit the HUSNG.com website. You'll find a link to it on the main page. There's a whole setup there. Just again, remember that you want to download the installer first, get your hardware ID, and have that available when you're paying for it. That way you'll save yourself some time. All right, I hope you guys, wish you guys good luck at the tables. I hope that you win some extra games thanks to the CoffeeHUD.